Okay, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the stream. So today I'm going to be talking to a fellow economist. Hello. And welcome. Sorry, everyone just will have heard me double up on the stream as I played it on YouTube just to see if it was working. Anyway, yeah, so today I'll be talking to a fellow economist and a fellow applied economist, Peter Backus. And basically what we want to ask, and the title on YouTube, and you may not have seen this Peter, but the title on YouTube is a nice clickbait title that says, "Is Empirical Economics Bunk?" So that is the overall question we're asking, right? The empirical quantitative studies that economists use, that a lot of other social scientists use, that you guys have seen me use in my videos, how credible really are they? Because numbers and statistics often seem very scientific, but are there issues underneath the surface? So Peter, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself first, and your background.
Hi, everybody. I am a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Manchester in the UK. I've been here for 9 years or something. Before that, I was at the University of Barcelona. I did my PhD at the University of Warwick, also in the UK. I am a bad academic in the sense that I have not really focused on one thing. I get bored pretty easily with topics. So I started my career doing research on philanthropic behavior and the behavior of fundraising organizations, charities, basically. I've done some work on some public goods type stuff. I've done some stuff on gender and competition. And more recently, the last couple of years, I've been working on sex work. There's sort of some issues around the economics of sex work. But I also have a long-standing interest in part because a lot of my work has been on issues around causal inference and how you can infer causality from observational data and the challenges that go along with that. And I've also been a long-time skeptic of the way we teach and the things we emphasize in applied methods in economics. So like econometrics, I think we've done that. Not even back to front. I think we've been doing it wrong for a long time. So that's why I was interested in talking to. Is it Dr. Unlearning or Mr. Unlearning? I'm not sure how to address you.
Dr. Economics, people have taken to calling me on the stream.
Dr. Economics.
Yeah.
That's why I follow Dr. Economics on Twitter, and you posted this thread that was I think. I thought it was a good thread, a good collection of links to various things of people rightfully questioning some of the stuff that we do in economics, especially, but sort of quantitative social science. Because I think like the American genius of sociology and political science, especially also in America, has basically become what economics has been. Our tools are overlapping a lot. Our emphasis on identification, causal inference, is also found there. The European versions of sociology are still quite qualitative, I think. So yeah, it's not just economics. So yeah, I think skepticism and questioning these things is always useful. And I thought you put together a good thread of interesting links and articles.
Great, yeah. So thank you. Yeah. So the thread that Peter is talking about is in the description, and I put it in like the YouTube chat and stuff. So if you haven't seen it on Twitter, you might want to go and check it out. And it's basically, there's a lot in there. It's like 30 tweets long or something ridiculous, but it was just a collection of mostly academic papers, but also some blog posts and some other things that I collated over the years that seem to point to some glaring, let's just say holes, and we'll figure out whether they're glaring, some holes in how we do like quantitative social science. And so yeah, so take a look. You can take a look while you're listening to the stream if you haven't seen it already. It's in the video description on YouTube. If you're on Twitch, it might be a bit harder, but you can just go on my Twitter. But anyway, so Peter, you said something that interested me then. You said you feel like we do the way we teach causal inference, quantitative economics, is backwards, back to front. You said something along those lines, right? So could you just explain that?
So the way we teach econometrics, I don't know how many people have been economics students or have studied econometrics, but when you come and do an economics degree, there's sort of the holy trinity of subdisciplines. So you do micro, macro, and econometrics, which are basically the tools that economists use to analyze data. And those are a huge array of tools, but we usually start off with regression analysis. That's usually the first stop. Once you leave statistics and you move into econometrics, we start talking about regression analysis. And I just think that's all wrong. I think you don't get to issues of causal inference. You might hit on it in sort of a 200, 300, 400 level class, but it won't be taken seriously until probably your master's degree. You spend a lot of time inverting matrices and proving the unbiasedness of OLS, and all kind of exciting mechanical, calculations to do. But I think misses the point. I think the main point of doing econometrics and learning those tools is to try to extract information from data. We observe how people behave, and we want to try to extract information from that raw material. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And I think the emphasis on causal inference is super important. I think it's probably the only thing for applied micro people, for me, for policy people, causality is the only thing that matters. Correlations don't really tell us anything, often very deceptive. And anytime you're running regressions, it's very easy to run regressions in something like R or Python or Stata, but they can be worse than useless if you don't understand what you're doing, and you don't understand how to interpret, and you don't understand the assumptions that are underlying what you're doing. And the reason I said I think it's taught back to front is that you go to your econometrics class and you'll learn these sort of statistical properties, and you'll invert matrices. If you've been in economics, you've definitely gone and, okay, it's x prime x over x prime y.
Yeah, you're giving me flashbacks.
Yeah, it's horrible, isn't it? And guess what? Nobody has ever done that. We don't do that by hand.
Yeah.
That's why we have computers. So I'm entirely sure why we do that. But the fact that we teach that stuff first, I think is wrong-headed, because the notion of causality, and I don't mean to have to talk about this like the supremacy of economics, but I think the way we should teach to our economics students is that the concept of causality is an economic concept. It is not a statistical concept. There's nothing in OLS that will give you causality. There's nothing in any method that will just give you causality. There's always assumptions that underlie it. And our job is to find settings that help us make a compelling case that the assumptions that underlie our causal inference are in fact true and hold. And that's really hard to do. But the fact that we teach it as sort of this statistical, this mechanical tool that can be applied to data, rather than getting people to sit down, think through notions of causality, understand what that means, looking for settings where you might be able to do something in order to find a causal relationship, and then applying the tools later, learning the mechanics later. That's why I think we teach it back to front. So if I was in charge, we'd spend the first year really just thinking about it, doing the sort of shoe leather work. Have you ever read The Ghost Map?
The Ghost Map? No, I don't think so.
Fantastic book about Jon Snow, not the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, the other Jon Snow. There's a pub in central London, if anybody who ever goes to central London, called the Jon Snow. Great little pub in Soho. Anyway, he's the guy that figured out that cholera was being spread through water. And he did that by basically doing a difference in differences really early on. But a lot of it was him going out in the world and drawing maps and figuring out where these water pumps went and where the source of the water came from and collecting data. And it was just a lot of shoe leather research, just out there trying to figure out how he can go about trying to answer this question and prove to people, prove to the policymakers of the day that it was in fact the water that was spreading the cholera. So he didn't invert any matrices. The statistical work he did was rudimentary by today's standards, and yet was one of the most important findings of his day. It was demonstrating that this horrific disease that was spreading like crazy was actually in the water and wasn't the product of miasma or whatever they believed at the time. So fantastic book, can't recommend it highly enough. But that kind of thing, that kind of approach to doing social science, I think, is what we should be teaching people, rather than x prime x over x prime y. That comes later.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I've not read the book, but I have read the David Friedman paper, which is on my reading list that I have for people, called Statistical Models in Shoe Leather, right? So it tells that very story of Jon Snow, and essentially what he did was like went out into the world and tried to understand it first, right? And then the statistics were like a tool afterwards, after he'd kind of established what the issue was and gone and seen, how things really work. He went and ran the numbers, right? So that's the kind of approach that you're advocating.
Yeah, and that approach of thinking about social problems, thinking about social science, thinking about trying to understand the world. And what's in the book that I think, if I read the paper ages ago, but what I think is lacking in the paper is how difficult it was for him to convince people. Like, he kind of knew that this was it. He had this sense, and from his like preliminary research, let's say, he had this idea, like, it's from the water, but he had to figure out a way to convince other people that that was the case. He had to, he had to create a compelling research paper that people could no longer deny was the evidence. And I think it goes in line with your thread, which is too often we're just we write a lot of crap. There's a lot of shit that's produced by economists. There just is.
Yeah. And
our work shouldn't be, oh, well, here's something I found and now let's have a debate about it. Good work should be, hey, this is an unbelievably compelling case that this thing exists. And here's the paper, and read my paper, and every objection that you can think of, I'll go through it. And if I can reject every one of your objections, then the thing that I'm trying to convince you of something. And so that your good work is really convincing. Good work is you finish reading it and you think, it's hard for me not to believe that right now. But unfortunately, I think there's so much shitty work that it all gets lumped together. So yeah, the interesting thing about Jon Snow, my point was just that it's very difficult for him to convince people. And I think that's the job of an economist or any sort of social science, is trying to convince people that what I've learned about the world is in fact true.
Yeah, so just addressing chat for a second. Wabber Cohen, number one, stop saying so many things, I've timed you out. Number two, it's not that David Friedman, it's not Milton Friedman's son, it's a different David Friedman who was a statistician in the 20th century. So I think this kind of leads in an indirect way. So I think I've got a few things to talk about, but the story of Jon Snow is a really good one because I think it paints a picture of somebody who was, able to go out into the wild and use kind of mixed methods and talk to people and, observe the world and all the rest of it over, I guess, I actually don't know. Do you know how long it took? I should imagine it took him a fair amount of time to do all of this.
I think it was years from the point that he kind of had the idea that this was probably what it was. And if I remember correctly, he actually went to like the London City Council or the Westminster City Council and was like, look, you guys, it's not miasma, it's the water. The water's the problem. And people just didn't believe him because there was this, the prior was that it's miasma. It's absurd to think it's in the water. It can't be in the water. Yeah. So changing people's minds was the challenge.
Yeah. So, I mean, he chipped away at this problem for quite a while. And I think if the thread I wrote, if people have seen it, there's a whole load of different stuff on there. And it's not really, I wouldn't call it like completely coherent. It's a whole load of different things that we might want to think about, right? I wasn't telling a deliberate story. I was saying, here's all this stuff I've seen that makes me doubt empirical economics. Let's have a conversation about it. But I think if there's one thing underpinning all of it, what I would say is that it's the current approach to research and the current researcher incentives, right? Because if you contrast to Jon Snow, who used mixed methods, who took a long time, what you have now is kind of a very narrow focus on people trying to publish like statistically significant results, trying to publish, probably quite a lot of different papers. There's far more papers published than there were, even 10 years ago. It just, the number keeps rising and keeps rising, right? And the result is that it seems like there's a lot of bias perhaps on the part of the individual researchers, but more worryingly on the part of the science as a whole. And so could you maybe just speak a little bit to this? Because I mean, I know that this is a concern of yours because your Discord name is 0.05 nonsense. So maybe you could talk a bit about it with reference to your Discord name.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So
Yeah.
yes, there's the incentives in academia. There's the incentives for for-profit journal publishers. There's the incentives for journals run by particular academic departments, where basically all the editors are from, say, Chicago, for example. There's a lot of problems. It's not just in economics. I think there's different problems across different disciplines. I think some things work better in economics than, say, sociology, and some things work better in sociology and economics. But I think one major thing, and the reason I chose this name is I thought this is what we might be talking about today a bit, is the idea of statistical significance. And I think that might be, if not certainly in the top 5 most harmful things that has ever been done to our ability to learn about the world. Like this idea that there is a threshold of meaning it's just so artificial and wrong-headed, and it just perverts so much of what we do. What's the rule that once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure?
Is that Goodhart's law?
Yeah, I think it's Goodhart's law. So 0.05 became a target, right? So it stops becoming a meaningful measure. And it was never meant to be a meaningful measure anyway. I mean, Ronald Fisher is the guy who came up with this. He said himself and had written, like, obviously this is dumb. Obviously you need to, and given the context and the study and whatever it is that you're doing, that we have to look at the continuous probabilities, and that might tell us something, but there is no threshold above or below which has any meaning. I think the reason that it happened is that we became manufacturers in academia. And what I mean by that is that I think if you're running a firm, so what the students T ratio, students T statistic came from Guinness, right? The Guinness factory. So let's say you're running the Guinness factory and you need to make a decision about whether to recall a certain batch of beer if it's bad. And so you test a few tins of beer to see if it's bad. I don't know what I mean by bad beer. I don't know, bacteria above some level or something. And for that, then for the decision about whether we should recall things or not recall things, you need a threshold. You're running a business. You need to make a binary decision. So you need a threshold above which you do not make the decision, and beyond which you don't make the decision, or vice versa. And so I think when it comes to something like manufacturing, something like quality control, then sure, having an artificial threshold kind of makes sense. But when it comes to how uncertain we are about a relationship between X and Y, between income and some kind of consumption, education and wages, whatever it is that you want to study, the threshold doesn't have any meaning, right? The calculation of these p-values, which is crudely put a measure of how certain we are that what we've measured actually is real and not just the product of random noise. The idea that there's some threshold that tells us, yes, there is a relationship, or no, there is not a relationship, is just crazy. It's really wrong-headed. The p-values and the idea of doing t-tests was to measure uncertainty. And I think when in social science we became manufacturers, we became, well, I have to produce a result, and I have a result if my p-value is less than 0.05, and I don't have a result if my p-value is above 0.05. And so we introduced this idea of a threshold into something where it's meaningless to have a threshold. It really is.
Yeah, it's funny, that story about Fisher saying, don't do this, but I'm just going to do it here. This is stupid. And then everybody latched onto it and just did it forever afterwards. It's amazing how many times something like that happens. Somebody introduces it and they're like, don't use this, don't do this. And then everyone else just ends up ignoring that and repeating what they've done.
Yeah, and I can kind of understand, like, I think as human beings, we're just really bad with uncertainty. We do a really bad job of assessing it. We're very uncomfortable with it. And this was a really easy way for me to say, yes, I found something, or no, I didn't find anything. Rather than saying, maybe, I don't know. It could be. It probably is, but we don't really know. We better do some more research.
Yeah.
Which is really what p-values are telling you. It just tells you how much of this, how much of a shrug you give. Is it a big shrug, or is it like, pretty good? But that kind of continuous appreciation of certainty, I just think as human beings, we're just terrible at. This is much easier. It's a yes or no. It's a yes or no answer. Hey, did you get a result? Yes, I have a result.
Yeah. Yes. Is it significant? Is it worth publishing? I mean, it's interesting. So what you just said it was really well explained about how, you know, statistical significance is like arbitrarily imposing a threshold on something that doesn't need to have it. So that's a general problem with the idea of statistical significance, right? But I think what we have now is not only do we have that general problem that you just explained, we also have the problem that people are targeting it, and therefore you end up with the perverse research incentives that we're talking about, right? So what you'll often see in published studies is that they tend to cluster a little bit around the values, the p-values of like 0.05, right? There'll be more there than there should be. If you look at the p-values of a whole bunch of different studies, they should be kind of smooth, right? There should be some kind of smooth relationship. But oh no, wouldn't you know it, you get a jump at like 0.05, you get another jump at 0.01, maybe even a smaller one at 0.1, right? All these special values. And that indicates that research is in some sense being gamed, right? There's some kind of perverse behavior going on. Yes.
Yeah. The measures became a target. Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of great papers. There's one called Star Wars Revenge of the Empirics or something, which documents exactly that. Which goes through, collects data from a whole bunch of papers that were published in the very top journals in economics, and finds exactly what you just said, showing that, look, this isn't what the distribution of p-values should look like if they were real. There's this bunching that you're talking about, and that's the fault of the researchers, absolutely, you know, engaging in some degree of p-hacking. How the degree to which it's conscious or unconscious is, I think, you know, tricky. It's the fault of the editors as well. It's the fault of the referees, right? It's the fault of our whole process of rewarding this threshold, rewarding the idea that you're beating this threshold, and therefore you're finding something.
Yeah, absolutely. So, person with a name where they've just hammered their hand on the keyboard, clearly, so I'm not going to try and pronounce it, asks, how would an alternative research program look like one without p-values? Or I guess without using p-values in the same way.
So I don't have a huge problem with p-values. I think we want to be able to measure uncertainty. We want to be able to say, look, I found that, you know, 1 year of extra education increases your wages by 10%. Okay, that's my point estimate. How certain am I about that? So I think one of our big problems is how we communicate that result. So one thing we could do, and this is something that I did in a paper of mine, and I had to fight with my co-authors to get them to do this. But I was like, okay, if I'm gonna talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. But it's scary when you do this. But we submitted the paper, it was eventually published. But we were like, we're gonna report the confidence intervals. Like, we're gonna have a table that has the point estimates, but in the text of the paper, we're gonna talk about the confidence interval. So we're gonna say it's not you know, a 1 year of education increases wages by 10%. We're going to say a 1 year increase in education increases wages between 2% and 15%. Like that's what we found. So it's somewhere in there probably. So I think how we communicate uncertainty is important. And first of all, banish the threshold. No more. The word statistical significance should cease to be part of the English language. We should never talk about it. It's meaningless. So ban the threshold. Ban the idea that something is significant or insignificant. Get more comfortable with the continuity of uncertainty, present results in a more uncertain way. And I think this goes not just for scientific journals, but the way that things are reported in the media, the way that like headline economic figures are reported on the news, right? We report things in the news like, oh, economists from the government predicts that GDP is going to increase by 2% next year. No, they don't. They make a prediction that it's going to change by -1 to 4%, probably somewhere in there.
Yeah, and that's just one study as well, right?
Yes, and that's just one study, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like we need to just be a lot more comfortable talking about the uncertainty and not demanding the point estimate. Part of the problem is I think ministers and bosses, your manager, whoever, wants a point estimate because that tells them the decision to make. Right? It says, okay, well, if we know it's going to increase by 2%, then we can do this. But we don't know that. Who knows what the future holds? We have a pretty good idea.
The private sector is just as bad, actually. It's, you know, because they really want like a tool to use and like, you know, here we are. It's significant. It's not significant. Therefore, we go ahead with this plan because it's significant, right? I have a friend who works in data science, and half his job, you know, he tells me is basically trying to explain that that's too simplistic an approach.
And some of the stuff that goes on, like the A/B testing, you know, I've heard stories of people that are like, oh, well, we kept running the A/B test until we got something significant. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? Yeah, what are you talking about? Like, that's a horrible way. What are you doing?
Yeah, we just keep
running it. We just keep running it. And I was like, okay, fine. So yeah, there's really bad statistics that is being done at I think all levels. It can be it's a dangerous tool to wield if you're not comfortable with it, confident with it.
I don't think I don't think I want to return to the time when economists had to do regressions using like tape and stuff like that, like ticker tape. I don't remember, but we didn't used to have computers. While I don't want to return to that, you can honestly say that the computers have been a real driver of this behavior, right? Because you can literally, you know, I could just download a data set now and run a whole load of regressions. I could run 100 regressions before I have dinner today, and some of them would be significant on pretty much any data set, right? So you can it's so easy to do that now. And then the other thing is that because we're human, right, we tend to, it's not that researchers are lying consciously or manipulating data as such, but the significant one, you'll be like, oh well, of course that's the case because blah 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 blah, and you'll make up a little story and you'll convince yourself, and then you'll go and find the literature that supports you in that conclusion, right? And then and then you get wedded to it, and you want to get it published, and before you know it, you kind of bought into this whole story that could essentially just be random, because the laws of classical statistics, you don't have to question classical statistics even. They tell you, literally, I mean, that's the whole point of statistical significance, right? Or p-values. If you run enough regressions, you're going to get something by chance, right? It's like, I mean, in the thread, I said this is like the statistical equivalent of like throw enough shit at the wall and some will stick, right? That's basically what it means. Yeah.
And I mean, this is something that also is not taught, I think, enough in econometrics. And this is something that I really got my head around until I was quite far along in my education. But when you're running multiple regressions, it destroys the premise upon which the t-test is even based, right? If you're just running lots and lots of regressions, then the interpretation of your p-values is no longer valid. The idea of that test is you do one piece of analysis, you do one measurement, and then this when you calculate your t-test, you calculate your p-values, it tells you, okay, that given that one measurement, here's sort of the again, crudely speaking, the probability that this is actually real and not the product of random noise. But once you start doing lots and lots of different regressions, let's use age squared instead of age, log age or whatever, you end up with a multiple comparisons problem. And so your threshold for, if you want to talk about statistical, your threshold should be much smaller than it actually is. You need to make an adjustment, which nobody ever does. Yeah. And I agree with you 100%. Part of me thinks we should go back to the days when you have punch cards. Part of me thinks like, maybe. Yeah, you shouldn't be able to run 1,000 regressions. Sit down, do your economics, think about the data that you have, think about the model that you think you should estimate, and that's the model that you get to estimate. And whatever you find, that's the result. That's what you do. The cheapening or reducing the cost of running regressions means we run a lot more regressions, which is probably a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, so short of taking people back to the punch card regression days, I mean, what do you think might be some ways of improving this kind of practice?
That's a good question. So I thought about that because on your thread, you propose a couple of solutions at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came up with some solutions as well. And one of them was actually, well, one, stop teaching critical values, like just get rid of thresholds entirely. But another was like, let's rethink data, like research data, in that even like research data sets. I mean, like the panel study of income dynamics in the United States or understanding society in the UK. Like these are surveys that are designed for social scientists to use to, I guess, try to understand society in the case of understanding society. I think the way we always think of it is, the way that we sort of teach people, like, well, you always want to get the raw data. You want to get the data in the rawest form possible. So like straight from the teat, so to speak. And then you spend a long time cleaning, preparing the data for analysis. Okay. But that requires, let's say there's 1,000 researchers that want to use the Understanding Society survey, which is a massive survey. It's very well designed. I think it's very well executed. It's really interesting. But then you have 1,000 people cleaning the data in 1,000 slightly different ways. You also have duplicate work. You have 1,000 people doing the same work, basically turning this very raw data into where you have like top codes and all sorts of things to turn it into data that you can actually say run a regression on. Why don't we centralize that? Why don't we have experts that we have experts that design the surveys, carry out the surveys? That's a different skill than the skills I have. It's very valuable. Why don't we have people who are experts in cleaning and maintaining the data? And they're like, look, if you want data from Understanding Society, it's individual level survey data about education, employment outcomes, all sorts of stuff. Then here is the research. Here it is. This is it. We've made all the decisions, and everybody gets the same version of the data with the same decisions made. So when you go to run your regression, if that's really what you want to do, everybody's running that on the same data. And we would eliminate a lot of this, the heterogeneity in these, hidden research decisions that we all make. You'd eliminate the I just dropped this group of people for maybe a good reason, maybe not a good reason. It got me the result that I wanted, or it got me my 0.049 p-value. So why do we rethink how we think about research data?
Yeah, I think I could maybe get on board with that as long as it was very transparent and, how the data had been cleaned and everything, because obviously you don't want to create like a cadre of people who are cleaning the data and nobody knows what they're doing, right? But yeah. No,
100%. Like super transparent, have everything sort of be done by a committee of social scientists. So you're not having one person making these decisions. You have a lot of people thinking through like, what is the best way to do this? Because I think another issue with like using data in economics and doing applied economics is there's very rarely a right way to do it. Right? There's very rarely like one correct way to, condition your sample to, do you log age, do you use age squared? There's not one right thing that we're all trying to discover. It's like I tell my students, we're social scientists. We're not physicists. We're not discovering immutable truths of the universe. We're trying to understand what people did by looking at data of what people did yesterday, what they did in the past. But there's not going to be universal truths. There's not going to be universal. So there's not a right way to measure something because we're not trying to get at something that's sort of pure truth in the same way that, I don't know how quasars work as pure truth, if that is true, I don't know. And so, yeah, absolute full transparency. Don't have a single person making the decisions. Have it all documented, but have everybody start with the same data, the same research-ready data. Eliminate as many of those little decisions as possible from people. But we don't have, and there's nothing like that. We always want the raw data, get the raw data. And then people say, oh, share your code, share the code that you use to clean your data. Now, I don't know what your code looks like when you clean data, but mine is not elegant. And I can share it, but the idea that somebody's going to be able to look at that and go, oh, I see what he did and why he did it is farcical.
Yeah, right? Even with the explanations, which only make sense to the person who's written them anyway.
Yes, yeah. And often don't make sense to the person who wrote it because I wrote it 3 years ago and I don't know what I meant.
Yeah, that was past me, who was obviously just an idiot. That's that. I think that kind of makes a lot of sense. So just to catch everyone up, so we've got a range of people in the audience, and I know some of you might not be familiar with some of this jargon and things. So a regression is like simply a quantitative technique to try and estimate the effect of one thing on another, right? So we might want to say, how much do your wages increase on average when you get a university degree, right? And then for that, you would have data on people who people's education levels and data on people's income, and then you'd run a regression to try and figure that out. Now that would be a very simple approach. You need a lot more sophisticated stuff to really tease it out, because there's obviously a lot going on in the real world. But yeah, that's the basic intuition of regression. So you were speaking a little bit about data choices in data cleaning, right? Which reminded me of this paper that I wanted to discuss a little bit with you, which you actually linked to me after the thread, which was the Huntington-Klein paper.
Yeah.
So yeah, could you go over that a little bit, because it was a really interesting example. I think arguably probably one of the most important parts of the thread was this kind of point. So yeah, it'd be good to go over it for people.
Yeah. So I think so Nick's paper I think is really good. Nick Huntington-Klein, who's a professor at Seattle U, and he also has a really good book. I think it's freely available, called The Effect, which is all about causal inference. So he wrote this paper that gave basically different teams of experimenters some data and then asked them to estimate a particular effect, right? And they came back and had different answers. And I thought the paper's really good, and it's worth a read. I think a better and more accessible, I think, example of that is an article that was on 538 about 7 years ago called "Science Isn't Broken." I think it's called "Science Isn't Broken. It's just a lot harder than we thought," or something.
Yeah.
Which does the same thing. So in that article, they took data about red cards and the race of soccer players, football players. And they gave it to, I think it's, 20 teams of quantitative research. These are academics, PhDs in social statistics and economics and quantitative methods. These are people that use data all the time. And asked them to estimate the effect of race on getting a red card. So the idea was, is there a difference in the probability a player gets a red card conditional on their skin tone?
Yeah.
All right. And they have a great figure sort of halfway down that article that summarizes the results. And basically there was a big difference in the results. There was, about a third of them found there was no significant effect. About 2/3 of them found there was a significant effect. One or two found that white players were more likely to get a red card. And then a couple of the studies found that black players were, 2 times as likely as white players to get a red card. And then most of the point estimates were suggested that black players were more likely to get a red card, but fairly small in the size of the effect. So Huntington-Klein does this in sort of a slightly more formal way and published it in a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. But the results are very similar in qualitatively in terms of what they mean. So I think that what they're pointing out, what both of these studies are pointing out, is that there's a lot of decisions that each one of these researchers is making. They're given the raw data, about player skin tone and red cards. What they choose to do with that data, how they condition that data, is often not talked about in the paper, right? It's sort of banal detail that maybe we don't think is necessary to report in the paper. But it clearly has a big effect on the outcomes. It has a big effect on the results. And when you then further abstract away from, say, the academic article, where maybe somebody reads that article very carefully and has appreciation for some of the decisions made because those are made explicit, or the methodology that was used, so they understand that methodology and why that might be good or bad in this particular setting. When you abstract into something that's going to be in the newspaper, and you think of these studies where one study found white players were more likely to get a red card, and other studies found that black players were 2 or 3 times as likely to get a red card, those are extremely different headlines and would lead to extremely different discourse in on Twitter, and newspapers, on Discord, wherever it is. You know, if one of those studies got published, it would be, oh my God, football is so racist. Look, black players are way more likely to get a red card. And if the other one was the one that was published, it would say, oh, look, football, there's reverse racism. White players are being punished. They're more likely to get a red card. So the trouble is, the further we abstract away the sort of hidden decisions made by the researchers, and then often when the population engages with it, we further abstract it away from that because we don't even see what's in the paper. We don't have appreciation for the methodologies that have been used. And then we get these headlines, and those headlines are completely dependent on which one of those studies was published. And then we have the publication bias, which is whichever one was first is the one that's going to get published in a really good journal and get reported on, and the one that's published second is not.
Yeah.
So we have this whole chain of problems that lead us to thinking we've learned something about the world, but actually we might have, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember as well that the decisions that the people who are creating the studies, the decisions they're making, it's not necessarily the case that there are obviously wrong decisions, right? It's not like they're like, you could look at it, you know, people could look at one study methodology without actually seeing the results, and they'd be like, oh, that seems sensible. I can see why they've used a logit model, which is like a type of statistical model, everyone, you know, and then another person would be like, oh, well, I can see why they dropped those outliers, those particular players from the study, because they seemed like they weren't in line with the rest of the observations. But you know, all of these seemingly sensible decisions can add up to a very, very different result on aggregate, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not sharing with your reader. You know, okay, it seems sensible that you excluded this particular subsample, but what was the effect of including that particular? You know, if you include that subsample, do all your results change? Why? So yeah, I mean, how do you do it in your paper? How do you do it in your, how do you decide, and how much do you make apparent to your reader about the decisions that you made?
Yeah, I'd like to say that it's all completely transparent, and of course I don't suffer from any of these problems. But no, I mean, obviously, I think what I can say is that everything that I know I do, I make explicit, right? But I think some of the issues come from the things that we don't realize we're doing, right? And so, you know, you may just do I don't know, a transformation of data. You may do some data cleaning or something like that, and you just don't really register that you've changed the data, that you've made a decision. And that's kind of what concerns me, because I think that's the type of thing that will create blind spots for like me as well as other people. I mean, you know, one good antidote to it is like having to explain it to co-authors. Those types of decisions that can help. But yeah, to be honest, I mean, I actually have a paper, or well, I'm not sure it's right to call it a paper, but I ran like some regressions, which were kind of like tests of economic theory, and it came out as basically just the results were just so absurd from the perspective of economic theory, right?
Yeah.
They seemed so wrong based on what we would know. They seemed to imply that, for example, people get negative utility from consuming, right, which we would obviously think is ridiculous. So basically what happened with that is that like it couldn't get published, and I just shelved it, right, because it's just a paper that has results that are so out of whack with everything we think we know. But ultimately, there wasn't really anything. I mean, there are lots of things wrong with it in the same way there are things wrong with every paper, but there wasn't anything noticeably wrong with it. It seemed like it was fine. But, you know, I have no incentive to push that paper because it's extremely unlikely that it will get published anyway, just because of how strange the results are. And I think the issue is, right, nobody ever finds out about that, right? If it doesn't, it's not just that the things that you do in the papers that are published don't get reported. It's the whole, or everything that hasn't even been published at all, everything that's been abandoned, that's that's completely invisible, right, to observers. So yeah, I mean, I've gone on for quite a while, but yeah, basically, if I'm completely honest, I think that, you know, I'm probably no better than anyone else in this regard, because I kind of, you know, make lots of decisions when I'm handling my data, and I follow the research incentives the same as a lot of other people.
But let me ask you about that paper.
Yeah.
So did you convince yourself that what you had found in the data was true?
No.
Okay.
No.
But that's different than responding to the research incentives, right? That's different than saying, I'm not going to submit this because I think it'll be rejected because culturally we wouldn't accept this result.
Yeah.
If you can't convince yourself, how can you possibly claim you're going to convince anybody else?
Yeah. Yeah. That's an absolutely fair point. I mean, another way of putting it is that I didn't try to convince myself, though, because I knew that it would be difficult to convince anybody else of it. So I don't know if it goes back like several meta levels to me not convincing myself, because I know that people can't be convinced. But yeah, I'm not sure. It's a good point.
But I think something like that is where I think good applied work can be really valuable, right? So we have a theory, we have some way of thinking about something, and I think this is less true today, but it was certainly true in the past, that economists confused theory with evidence, which is not the case. And then it took a really compelling, a really convincing piece of evidence of applied economics to convince people that the theory was somehow flawed. So I guess the classic example would be minimum wages. And Carden-Kruger. Is it Carden-Kruger? Yeah, Carden-Kruger, 95. So these guys, there's a very famous paper in economics. It holds up a bit today, but I think it's come under criticism. But the results are also found in other places. But basically, these guys got some data, and using some very clever shoe leather work, they provided some evidence that an introduction of a minimum wage actually increased employment. Now, this was, like Dr. Economics was saying, his result, it would have been heresy. This result was heresy when it first came out. I mean, people were like, this is absurd. These guys are clowns. There's no way this can happen. Look at our theory tells us there's no way this can happen, and therefore there's no way this can happen. You guys are a bunch of bozos. So Card just won the Nobel Prize. Kruger would have, but he sadly passed away a few years ago. And since then, that result has been replicated in other settings that suggest that actually the effect of the minimum wage on employment is either nothing or might be slightly positive. And we have have a better understanding of why that might be. So I think if you, Dr. Economics, produced a paper that you could convince yourself that what you found was right, and you could convince me or your referee or your colleague that it was right, like that's a major contribution. I think the challenge in applied work more generally is really convincing people, is really making that a compelling case. I think that is the real challenge.
I did actually reflect on that paper after my thread, and I thought I should go back to it and, like you said, practice what you preach, right? And see if I can convince some people. I mean, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this, right? Because we've been a bit negative, I guess, so far. And you brought up Carden-Kruger, and people who are on my channel will know that from the video, the Econ 101 video, which was mostly about this minimum wage example. And they used the difference in difference method, which we also referenced earlier, that Jon Snow kind of first used, maybe. I think he was the pioneer of it. And that basically just compares areas that are probably next to each other or similar in some way, and where there was an intervention in one area, say a policy like the minimum wage, and there wasn't in another area. Now, they should be otherwise the same, these two adjacent areas. And so whatever effect you observe on, say, employment in the minimum wage area should be just due to that change rather than due to anything else. So this is the idea. It's difference in difference that it kind of gets rid of all the noise, and you're just comparing, two similar things, one of which has received the policy and one of which hasn't. But so this is that was arguably the Card-Kruger paper, the start of what people sometimes call the empirical revolution in economics, in applied economics, right? And or the credibility revolution, sometimes people call it. And empirical economics has advanced by quite a lot, right, over the past 3 decades or so.
Yeah.
So there has been quite a lot of progress, right? It's not all negative.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. No, we're doing a much better job today than we were in the 70s and 80s. And that's in part because we have access to better data, but also because our methods have improved. We've learned a lot about how to extract information from data in a more convincing and compelling way. We have a better understanding of the assumptions that underlie claims about that causality. I think it's ongoing. I mean, the past couple of years, I don't know how much you follow the diff literature and the two-way fixed effects literature, but over the past 3-4 years, we've overturned a ton of stuff. And that's actually something I wanted to ask you about. So for those of you guys, I don't want to get overly technical, but basically there's sort of a workhorse approach to applied work, where you use two-way fixed effects. You have panel data. Don't worry about what it means, but basically everybody does it. For a long time, people used it, and they're like, "Oh, now I have a causal effect." Then we were like, "Well, that part's not true, but you can still use two-way fixed effects." And now we're actually figuring out and being able to understand that using two-way fixed effects is probably introducing a bias. It's not actually a good thing to do in a lot of settings. Using continuous treatment, using treatment with differential timing, all these things that we've been using for at least the past 20 years, post Card-Kruger, we're now understanding are not right. And so I had a question for you. What do we do? So first of all, I just want to say, I don't have a problem with that. We're learning. I think you said somewhere in your thread, we haven't solved this, or I don't trust these things reflectively. This is a process. I think we need to be a lot more humble in economics when we make these claims about, oh, we found this, we found that. And I tell my PhD students when they say, oh, well, this proves X. We don't prove anything in social science. We have evidence in support of an idea, but that's all we have. We never prove anything.
Yeah.
So I think we are doing better. We can be more humble. But my question for you, Dr. Economics, is what do we do with the old stuff that we now know is probably wrong? And not wrong because the outcome is wrong, but wrong because we know the methodology is wrong. It might be with a newer method applied to that same data. But what do we do with the body of knowledge that we've accumulated when we now realize actually the approaches we've been using were not right?
It's funny. I was almost going to ask you the same question. I have it written down. There's a very similar question with the same example. So yeah, it's basically, I think to put it in a nutshell, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but economists for a while with this difference in different stuff that I just explained, the Card-Kruger, they've been assuming that the treatment, the policy, the intervention, whatever you want to call it, is a kind of one-off, right? It's we put in the minimum wage and now there's a minimum wage. Great. Now, in reality, because of pragmatic, political, feasibility considerations, usually it's gradual, right? You'll increase the minimum wage $1 a year for 5 years, I don't know, something like that. Now, it turns out that if you do something like that, the statistics are very different. They come out very different. And if you assume that you're just doing it as a one-off, when actually you're increasing the minimum wage gradually, then you might come to completely the wrong conclusion about the effect of the minimum wage on unemployment. You might conclude that it doesn't increase unemployment when in fact it does. So that's where we are, right, with the difference in difference literature. And what do we do with the all of the previous stuff? I mean, I think, the most obvious answer, and maybe this isn't a very deep answer, but I would say the most obvious answer is that we should replicate it with the new method, right? That seems to me to be, to go through the old stuff and say, okay, we've now got this new estimator, this new approach. We know that it accounts for things that the old one didn't. We did a load of stuff with the old one. We said minimum wages were good, but maybe they're actually not. And we need to be able to go through the same kind of studies, I think, and reproduce them, but with the new methods. I mean that would be the most obvious thing. But
who's going to do that?
Yeah, yes, exactly. That's not rewarded, right? I don't think people want to do it, and I don't think they're incentivized to do it. It's boring for a start, but also it's boring from a career perspective because, I went over, Dubé's 2010 paper on the minimum wage using a new method. That's not going to get published in as good a journal as the original paper, certainly, right?
I'd say definitely not. I think economists are finally coming around to replication studies. So I don't know if you saw, JPE has a new set of baby journals, and yes. John List is one of the editors, and they said we're going to welcome replication. So there will be some degree of replication, but replication isn't taking the same data and doing different analysis. Replication is basically running the same experiment in a different setting and seeing if it replicates. And the idea of trying to go back and use the same data but apply an updated method is not rewarded. And yeah, it would be fucking boring. It would be really boring. And my guess is a lot of the better stuff I think will hold up, because I think the better work, there's a lot of sort of robustness checks. There's a lot of effort to challenge their headline result and make sure it maintains. Robustness checks can be perverted as well, but I think good people.
It's worth saying the Card and Kruger paper, the original one. I mean, I read it, years ago when I was a student, and then I kind of read it more recently because I was making that video, and I did think, still today, that's a very good paper. They do a whole load of stuff challenging their assumptions. So, you're right. You've got to take it on a case-by-case basis. I think the wrong thing to do would be just to say, well, that's all wrong, all that stuff before this date when we discovered this new method of estimating the effects of the minimum wage. That's all wrong. Let's ignore everything that happened up until now. I think that would definitely be wrong. So yeah, I guess it has to be on a case-by-case basis, right? Sorry to interrupt. I just thought that's a good example.
I've been asking people this question because I'm hoping to run like an advanced causal inference course when I get back from a sabbatical. And so I've been trying to keep up with all the stuff, the diff and diff advances, the two-way fixed effect advances, the stuff on synthetic controls. All of this is changing really, really fast. And so I'm left with this question, well, what do we do with all this other stuff? I think you're right. It's not like we can't just throw it all out, but nor do I think we can just cite these things uncritically anymore. So it's hard to know what to do with it. Because so much stuff is two-way fixed effects here and there, whether they have a continuous treatment. Now there's a lot of evidence that actually including controls can introduce a bias if you have your two-way fixed effects. So I think we're in for a rocky period.
It's related. There was this this Christopher Aitchen paper that was in my original thread on this subject, and he shows, I think it's a political science paper, but he just uses simulations to show that sometimes adding controls can actually introduce bias, right? So we're used to, with regression, it's like, if you want to look at the effect of education on wages, well, maybe you need to condition for things like socioeconomic status, because maybe rich people just get more education and also have higher wages, or the kids of rich people, I should say, and that's what's driving the results. So you need to control for things like that, and race and gender and blah, 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 right? But he shows, Aitchen, and I think this is true of the examples you were just talking about, right, that sometimes adding more can mess things up as well.
Yeah.
So it's like, do we want to, on the one hand, we want to add more controls because that makes sense to control for things that we're not interested in, right? And but that might be biasing our results. But on the other hand, if we add the wrong controls, then we might bias our results as well. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that makes me despair a little bit, because it's a bit of a minefield, right?
So I think it is a bit of a minefield. I think it is. It is a minefield, but I think it's something that we can do correctly. So I think going back to what I was saying originally about teaching econometrics, that how we teach econometrics is that you have your outcome, and then you have to have your controls, and then you have the variable that you're interested in, and that's just not how you should be doing it at all. I think our understanding of colliders. I was never taught about collider, but this is going to be maybe too technical, but I was never taught about collider bias. I didn't understand colliders until I read Udaya Pearl's books. And I was like, oh, so, you know, this particular type of control with these characteristics introduces a bias. It can reduce one bias, but it can introduce a separate bias at the same time. But now there's some work by Santana that's even showing exogenous controls. Let's say you have fully exogenous variables that you want to include on your right-hand side that will shrink the standard errors around your variable of interest. Even if you have them wholly exogenous, still can introduce a bias if you're using two-way fixed effects. So, like, yeah, it's kind of like, fuck, we really need to be reading and stopping and educating ourselves and having an understanding about the typology of potential control variables, what we mean by control variables, when they help, when they don't. I think the use of DAGs, so directed acyclical graphs, like, are really, they're fun to play with, but can be really powerful in terms of clarifying your thinking about what it is that you're estimating and what should be in there and what shouldn't. So I think it is a minefield, but I think it's a minefield that with care and some humility and some education, you can navigate. You can, and you can produce good, convincing, compelling empirical work. I just think it's getting ever harder to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no. So that is more encouraging. There are ways of knowing what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and there's been progress in that area. So one other thing I wanted to ask you was, what do you think, and this goes back to some of my solutions that I put in the thread, what do you think about economists doing more kind of historical work, qualitative work, you know, basically going outside and talking to people, two things that economists might be reluctant to do. But what do you think about doing more of that?
What do I think about doing more of that? I think that it is good. I think depending on the type of work that you do, I think talking to the people that are the subject of your research is probably enlightening, edifying, if nothing else. So the work that I'm doing on sex work, I've talked to some sex workers. It helped me get an understanding of what that market looks like. What is their day? What is a transaction like? Because I've never used a sex worker. So talking to them. Now, I didn't use any of that in our paper. The paper we have up right now is a huge paper, and then we have two more that are coming soon. So I haven't used any of those conversations per se, like in my research. There's nothing in the paper that says I talked to so-and-so and they told me this. But it was useful, I think, just to try to have an introduction to that. I'm not a trained qualitative researcher. I think qualitative research is unbelievably difficult. I think any kind of research is unbelievably difficult, but I think good qualitative research, and by good I mean useful, is really, really, really hard to do. I am not trained to do it. I'm not qualified to do it. Nevertheless, I found that exercise useful. You mentioned the historical stuff. So economic history now it's hot. It's super hot. It's like all the rage. Everybody's super into it. I have doubt. I get doubt. We should all have doubts about any applied work. But I have doubts that the level of hotness that it currently has is justified. I think it's very cool to write a paper about a pirate ship that sank, and that was a shock to the gold supply of Spain or something. That's kind of a cool paper to write. I'm not sure what it tells us about the world. So I think there's a place for it, but I do wonder about the usefulness of it in terms of what it tells us about, how current money work in the world. But I think learning our history is important and can be useful. I mean, we're just entering a world of inflation. Maybe looking back at the 70s, we could learn something from that, right? They did it then. Maybe we try to avoid some of those mistakes. So I guess a little bit of yes, a little bit of no. I did have a question for you, which I looked at your solutions, and you said economists should rediscover qualitative work. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so qualitative work, well, I mean, I was using it as quite a broad label, I have to admit. Like, when people say qualitative, they often mean, like, interview techniques. But I did mean kind of broader historical work as well. And I think it's about really just understanding what's going on and what people are thinking. So, I mean, let me illustrate it with an example. So I did a video about worker democracy, and I looked at the policy of worker board membership, where workers are legally entitled to be on the boards of corporations in Germany and in Finland and in some other countries, but the studies were in Germany and Finland. And in one of the studies, I think it was the Finland one, well, in both of them, they found that this actually didn't seem to have much of an effect on anything, this worker inclusion policy, much to my surprise and annoyance, I have to say. It didn't seem to be a policy with very much bite. And they wondered why that was. And that in their explanation, I think, no, it must have been in the German paper, they looked at some history. So they said, well, okay, here's one thing. This policy was actually a compromise that was arrived at, which was why it was quite random, which allowed them to statistically estimate its effects. People weren't expecting it. And it was a compromise, and the left-wing parties at the time were really against it because they thought that it was minority representation, about a third of workers on boards, wasn't enough. They thought that wasn't enough. You're giving away too much to capital, to the bosses, to the managers, blah, blah, blah. So that was one piece of historical evidence that said, okay, that helped us to understand the result, right? Maybe this policy doesn't really have an effect. History says that it was a compromise, and workers' parties at the time thought it wasn't enough. And the second thing they did was they then interviewed the workers, right? And the workers said, yeah, it doesn't matter that we're on the boards. They don't listen to us, right? Basically. Yeah. And so there you have kind of historical and interview evidence that helps you to understand what seemed like on its face a kind of puzzling result, right? So that would be a good example. That's how I think that type of evidence should be used, because it can help you to understand, what's going on, what's driving your results.
So, I won't be devil's advocate, but like, I don't know, minor demon advocate. Not even that. I think it's actually, no, this is a question. So why do I need a qualitative approach for that? Why do I need to talk to any workers to figure out that exact story? Why can't I just collect data on the number of people on each one of these boards, the number of workers on each one of these boards, and go, look, the board operates by majority rule. There's only 25 to 33% workers on the board. That's why it doesn't have any bite. They're in a minority. They don't have enough power to change what the board does. Why do I need to talk to a worker to figure that out?
I don't know. I mean, I guess my point would be that I don't know how things actually happened, but in the way they wrote the paper, they were kind of puzzled, right? So I guess it's like an explanation that seems kind of obvious after the fact, right? But I don't know if it was at all obvious at first as an explanation. Because I guess that we can I don't know, make up stories about our results, and we can try and interpret them. But this type of qualitative research tells us, or helps to tell us, whether or not something is actually the case. So I think, I don't know. I feel like it's unfair, devil's advocate, Peter Backus, to reason from, because you already know. I just told you the reason, and now you're like, well, I could have known that before you told me.
No. I didn't mean I would know that before. I meant there's a quantitative approach that would lead me to that same conclusion, right? There's just like, well, let me just collect data. What do these boards look like? Who's on these boards? And I could look at that, and if you could collect data on the manner in which decisions are these majority rule? Are these, how are decisions made on these boards? Yeah. And then you could get to the same answer. I agree. I think talking to people is great and can be really revealing. And I think in terms of like the shoe leather work, I think so I just said it. For me, the advantage of actually talking to people out in the world is more useful. I mean, in this particular case, I think it was useful, the example you gave, but I think it's more useful for understanding and finding opportunities to estimate causal effects. Because a lot of that is going to be from understanding how these boards work. Go into a parole board and understanding like how do you decide if someone's parole? There's a score, and if they get above this score, oh well, now I have a RD set up. So I think talking to people and understanding how decisions are made at institutional levels opens up a better understanding of, or more opportunity to look for natural experiments where you might actually start to measure causal effects. I think that's a really good reason to talk to people. I mean, something like this paper sounds like it worked for them. The paper was an interesting paper, so it was to their benefit that they did that.
Yeah.
But I think the shoe leather, figuring out how are things working, talking to people is good. But I always tell my students, like, I don't care what people say they do. I care what people do. That's why I like economics. That's why I like data. I find people, including myself, often have very little understanding about why I do or don't do the things that I do. We like to rationalize, ex post. Oh, I planned that all along. But in reality, I don't think we do. So when you ask people why they're doing stuff or why they feel a certain way, I could have asked sex workers how they felt about the change in the law. They also have an incentive to feel a particular way because it affects their pocketbook. It affects their business. So I think it's always hard to trust what people say, not because people are liars. I think just people don't understand themselves very well. So I'd agree. I think there's scope for more qualitative work, more talking to people, but I'm not sure it's a solution to some of the problems that we face in applied work.
So one thing is to say that your sound's cutting out a little bit every so often. I don't know if you can easily do anything about that. I don't know if you've got your mic sensitivity down. It's okay. You're still intelligible. Like, it's not that bad, but it's just every so often there's a little bit of silence and we miss a couple of words.
Crumbs. I don't think I can do much about that.
Maybe
happened for the whole hour.
No, it's only recent. I wouldn't have just told you now. No, it's only recent. It's okay. It's really not. Of all the sound issues that happen in streams, it's near the bottom end of. In how
all right,
bad
if it continues, let me know. I can switch to I'm on the headphones. I can switch to the computer.
Okay.
If that's better.
I think it's fine. If it gets bad, then we'll switch. But I mean, I think just to say one final thing on this. So I'm not gonna, I agree with you on that use of qualitative research. I think what I liked is that, as researchers, we have our own perspectives, and they're often kind of ivory tower perspectives. Let's be honest, most of us haven't really had real, what you might call a real job or something like that. And I think what I liked about asking the workers was, well, the workers, they do have that experience of like what actually goes on in the corporation at a kind of fine-grained level, right? They have that, what Hayek would have called localized knowledge. And so that's why I like kind of going to them for the explanation. Now, of course, it's true. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to. In this case, it seems to have cohered and all made a lot of sense. In other cases, the qualitative and the quantitative don't. And there's another paper which looks at a randomized control trial from a quantitative and a qualitative perspective, and it found that the two results were different, right? And it kind of explored that, and that was a really interesting source of tension. So it doesn't mean you have to say they're right, but I do think that they have a lot of knowledge that the researcher doesn't, and that's why it's a good reason to ask them. Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah. That makes sense. I wouldn't discourage people from economists from talking to people. I just wonder if that's a solution to some of the problems that like you raised in the thread. I don't know how that fixes things. But yeah, I think it can be certainly beneficial for the research.
I think it's like if you get a coherence between the qualitative and the quantitative, then I think that's like, for me, that's like great. It seems like, we're more credible here now, right? They're both agreeing. So that would be kind of what the holy grail would be, right? What you're searching for. Now, of course, in most cases, you probably won't, like I just said, right? But it's just it's like another check on your results, right? It's another way of trying to verify them. And yeah, that's why I like it as it was one of three things I said, right?
Yes, that's true. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the other two.
Yeah. Okay.
So one, you said less publishing.
Yeah.
So I think you said like half the amount of public tenure, and you'll have to. So I think that's a good idea, and I think that's kind of what economics does relative to other social sciences. So if you look at like a sociologist CV, a whole bunch of publications. People are like, wow, it's great, so many publications. And you'll look at an economist and they'll have 3.
Yeah.
I think we as a discipline do publish a lot less. And I think because it's so much harder to publish in economics. So I feel like, would you like us to publish even less?
Yeah. And I think, so I think it would, that tweet was 280 characters, as all tweets are, and I would have perhaps could have said more about what I'm envisioning, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, for those of you who weren't here, which is that, you know, it would be good to have people more engaged with the data, what the data means, before they start running regressions and doing all this fancy stuff, right? And so my idea of a kind of, you know, papers in economics is that they would also, you know, value that more, and you could kind of have papers instead of quite a lot of papers, which I still think, although it's less than other social sciences, it's still more than it was in the past, right? And instead of ones which are necessarily kind of focused on causal effects, right, and the final, you know, shiny p-value, you might have ones that kind of build up the story a bit better, from, you know, working with the data, and somebody had been working on it for a long time, as with Jon Snow, right? And it just kind of told the full story instead of kind of skipping to the shiny causal effect. So that would take longer to produce that, I think, right? If you're talking about, especially if you're talking about like gathering data or something like that, it would take longer to produce something like that. And that's why I think that I would reduce research incentives, not because they reduce the number of papers you got to publish, because ultimately, you know, that means you can take a little bit longer in engaging with individual projects. Yeah, so that's it. And I also would say that I think that, you know, books as well are something which maybe should be valued, and they more within the economics profession, which I think is something that economists, I think they've been on their way out a bit in academia, in social sciences, but economists especially don't value them. So kind of, you know, gone are the days where you'd have a kind of almost a 10-year project where somebody really delved into something. Now you've got to publish quite a lot of papers on it. So I'm trying to, in that tweet, maybe I was not as general as I could have been, but I was trying to push more back towards that kind of model.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you about books. I think books, I don't know how to feel about books. I feel like a lot of books get written by academics that nobody they're so niche, and it's going to be the next PhD student a decade from now that's studying that very niche subject. Saying that, I think economics is wildly undervalue books. I'm not even sure books would count towards tenure or towards probation.
I don't think so.
We have pretty rigid ranking of our journals, and I think fairly clear expectations about what is required at different institutions. They're different, but what's required. But yeah, I think books are undervalued. But when I saw the tweet about publishing less, I think that's a good idea, and I think we do a better job of that in economics, and I think other social science. I think a lot of crap, and this isn't to diminish sociology. I think there's a lot of great work that comes out of sociology, but I think because the expectations there are, if you want to get tenure, 15, 20 publications on your CV, it just incentivizes a lot of sort of just filler.
Psychology is similar as well, isn't it? And psychology is the kind of king of the replication crisis and all of this stuff that we're talking about, right? There's so many silly little studies that have come out of psychology that just, and psychologists, like sociologists, I think, I'm not sure who publishes more frequently, but they have, they'll write a paper in 6 months, psychologists, and they'll release it from conception to release. It'll be kind of 6 months, and they'll have so many papers on their CV, and it's just that just puts into hyperdrive all the problems we've been talking about, right?
Yeah, and it's the same experiment with some little twist, and they've got 10 papers on it. And you're like, come on, guys, what are we doing? What is this? So I think in economics do that. The other thing you mentioned was predicting out of sample.
Yes.
Which I was always taught is very naughty. that you should not be predicting on a sample. That is not the done thing. Could you explain what you meant by that a bit more? You linked to something, but I haven't actually read what you said there. But as a way of...
Yeah, so I'm curious as to why. I'll answer first, but I'm curious as to why you were told that was kind of a bad idea. So it's like, so I was kind of inspired by the rise of like machine learning, where what you typically do is you know, they'll separate out a data set. So they get a whole load of data, and what they'll do is they'll separate it into a training data set, they call it, I think, and another data set. I forget what the other one's called. And then what they'll do is they'll fit the model. They'll run all the statistical stuff on the training set, right? And then they get like their predictions, you know, it's often on websites, so I don't know. Here's the effect of changing the color of the text on the website on the number of clicks that we get, right? Something like that. And what they'll then do, though, so that would be where we often stop in social science, I think. We just get the kind of the best fit. And what they'll then do is they'll get the data that they didn't use, the data that they kind of put to one side, and they'll say, okay, how does our model that we have from the training data set only, how well does that predict what we have in the other data set? And that is kind of like a proper test, right? That's like a proper scientific test. And that is very difficult in social science. There's no two ways about it. A lot of out-of-sample tests are going to be pretty poor. I think that most macro models have pretty poor out-of-sample predictive properties. But
that in-sample predictive properties.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, we could go into that. Yeah, I was wondering how long it would take for us to insult macroeconomics. It's been an hour and 20 minutes.
I can't believe we made it this long.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, that's kind of like a proper scientific check. And I think the key thing about that is, and this goes back to like the purpose of science, right? And Milton Friedman's methodology of positive economics, where he said the purpose of science is prediction. Now, you can moan, as I do, about all of the assumptions that go into these statistical methods, about all of the potential issues with the data. But ultimately, if it has that out-of-sample predictive power, then it's good enough, right? It helps us predict the real world. So who cares? Yeah, okay, I know people aren't really like log incomes walking around, and you know, I know that perhaps some of these assumptions we've made about common trends in difference aren't strictly true. But look, it predicts the real world, right? So that's what I would like to aspire to, you know, ideally.
Okay, so I got a couple questions then. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's not predicting out of sample. Mm-hmm. If I take a sample of 1,000 people, and then I random sample of 1,000 people, and then I randomly assign 500 of the people in my sample to my training set and 500 to my test set, right? Those are the same. That's the same sample. Like that sample is taken from the world at the same time. So the characteristics of the world at the time that I drew that sample are the same. Those two subgroups that now one I'm training on and the other I'm testing on. Hmm. And maybe this is just a language thing, but to me, the idea of predicting out of sample would be, I take a sample of 1,000 people from today and I do some analysis, and then I make predictions about people tomorrow. And I see how well those predictions. And the reason why I was taught a million years ago when I was an economics student not to predict out of sample is that tomorrow is not the same as today. There's going to be unobservables that are different tomorrow that are not the same as today. And so my prediction tomorrow will be worse than predicting the sample. And this is something I also teach to my students, is that this is, for me, and you correct me if you think I'm being silly here. For me, this is a problem of our language. This is really a semantic issue. And I think it even goes back to Friedman. I think it was a semantic issue. So I think, and not in Friedman's head, his weird head, I think what he meant was predicting about the future. When I talk about in my data, you know, how well does my model predict my data? It's sort of, how well does it explain the data that I already have? There's no temporal dimension in terms of it's predicting stuff that is yet to happen. How well does my model predict what is in my data? So if I run my regressions and then produce my y hats, how close are my y hats to my y's? Right? That's the prediction that I guess I'd be interested in. That model sort of, I think, is telling me something about my data. Predicting out of sample would be then take that model and apply it from that I collect tomorrow and see how well that maintains. So I think what we really do, I think maybe what Friedman meant was the point of science is to explain. And this word predict and explain, we use kind of as economists, not even interchangeably, we predict a lot more, right? The model predicts this. Do we see that in the data? It's not about predicting the future. So I don't know. What did you?
I feel like we might be in agreement, and it's an issue of language. Because prediction, I mean, I'm not big on making. I mean, it's like it goes back to like forecasting, right? And we can beat up on macroeconomics again, but like forecasting is often a bit of a fool's errand in social science in general. I completely agree with that. So I think predict is more of a. It's more like when I was talking about the training set. It's like from the perspective of the training data. It doesn't know about the non-training data, right? That's the kind of prediction I'm talking about. The model that you fitted didn't know about that data when you made it, but you're right that it comes from the same distribution, and that's key because distributions and variables may be constantly shifting in economics, right? So, I mean, I do know of a couple of future predictions, well, at least one actually, which was the Daniel McFadden discrete choice model, where he correctly predicted the number of passengers to like a decimal place, predicted the number of passengers that would take up the new San Francisco rail system or tram system or something like that. So he used his models before the policy was implemented, and he said, not as many people as you think, policymakers, are going to use this. Here's how many people are going to use it. It's only like 13.6% of passengers or whatever. And then he turned out to be right. But I don't know. I mean, that's a very good example, but I think generally speaking, it's too difficult, right?
Yeah. Who said that, predicting is hard, especially when it's about the future? Can I ask you about something else? It's semi-related to the prediction of the future. So, are you familiar with the rationalist community?
Yes, kind of. Yeah, like Scott Alexander.
Yes, Scott Alexander.
Yes, yeah.
So, some of the people I think are people that are trying to think. Some of it is sort of, I don't know, proto-white nationalism dressed up with a bow tie. When you're navigating the rationalist, I think you always have to get like 3 paragraphs in before you're like, okay, now I'm going to take this seriously, because it can be a bit hit and miss. However, some of it I think is at least I think well-intentioned, good faith attempts to better understand the world. However, one thing that they like to engage in is make predictions about the future and assign those predictions probability. Right? So McFadden made a prediction of the future, and that prediction turned out to be right. Mm-hmm. And so we would say McFadden is smart, or McFadden can predict the future in this particular case. Right? He's not an oracle, but in this case. My question, and I've tried to talk to people, I find it really interesting, but what is the point of assigning those probabilities? So you'll see sometimes these people will say, oh, I predict Joe Biden will be impeached 10% chance. I predict that the Ukraine war will still be going on by the end of the year, 70% chance. Let's say both of those things happen. Is this person a good predictor? Like, what do those probabilities tell us? Because we don't observe the world a million times, and therefore observe whether the probabilities that they assigned were accurate. We observe one outcome. We don't observe the probability distribution from which it's drawn. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
For me, I'm curious about whether or not this assigning of probabilities by the rationalist is just some like pseudo intellectual nonsense, because I don't understand what I'm supposed to learn about the person making the prediction if their prediction comes true and they assign, say, a 90% probability or a 10% probability.
Yeah. Yeah, Nate Silver gets into trouble every 4 years with the Football World Cup, doesn't he, with this? Because he assigns probabilities to people winning, but then whether they do or they don't win, he's been accused of saying, well, that was accounted for because the probability is between 0 and 100, right? Brazil are going to win. He says, well, I only said there was a 90% chance they'd win. When they lose, it's like, there was a 10% chance they'd lose. So, yeah, we can only run reality once, right? So
Yeah.
it's difficult, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, you know, probability, if you get into it, I don't know how much we want to get into it. I don't know how much we can get into it. I'm no expert on it, but it is designed around things that you can kind of repeatedly do, right? Like flipping a coin, right? I mean, probability was invented because of gambling, right? To analyze gambling, depressingly. I think that's actually the origin story of probability theory. So, you know, you can flip a coin and again, and you see, yes, it's 50% heads, 50% tails, roughly. But with these things that only happen once, otherwise known as history or reality, I don't know. I don't know how much sense it makes. And it comes down to, like, people talk about the difference between probability, between risk and uncertainty, don't they, right? Like, things you can assign a probability to and things that you just can't. And yeah, I think I'm not so sure about this assigning probabilities, because is there really a basis through which to test them? You'd have to have a model, and this is what Nate Silver does do, to be fair to him. You have to have one consistent model which you repeatedly use to make predictions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like by model I mean a statistical model, right, that you can write down and people can see it and run it. But then, is it pseudo-intellectual nonsense when some dude just says, I think there's a 70% chance of this and a 30% chance of this? Because they don't have a model. They can't rerun that. They can't test it, right? So if you can't test it, then what's the point? Yeah, I don't know.
What's the point? What do I learn about you as a predictor from the probabilities you assign if I see the event happen? Like, that's what I don't understand, and I've never gotten a clear answer. So this brings us kind of full circle, because back to McFadden, but back to uncertainty that we were talking about at the beginning in p-value. So McFadden predicted to the decimal point the percentage of people that were going to use the public transport or something. All right, what was the confidence interval around his point estimate?
That's a good question. I don't know is the answer.
You know, how certain was he of this? And did he say, look, it's going to be between 2% and 25%. So on average, you know, in the middle, 13%.
Yeah.
And that number turned out to match what happened in reality. But so like I think what you said about models is really important. I think too often we determine the value of a decision, the quality of a decision, based on how well it predicts the future, when really it should be about the process through which that decision was reached, the process through which that prediction was reached. So the quality of the model that was used, because you might turn out to be wrong, right? Nate Silver's model might be amazing. It predicts Brazil is going to win with a 90% chance. And maybe if we could observe the universal probability distributions for the different teams winning the World Cup, it would be indeed the fact that Brazil wins 90% of them. However, in our one version of the universe, they don't win. But his model might be perfect, right? It might exactly predict the right probability distribution. But we can never observe that. But nor can we say Nate's a good or bad predictor because Brazil did or did not win. We can only determine whether or not he's a good predictor based on the quality of the model. So I just struggle with those models used to predict reality, because reality can only be run once. I might be really going off into the weeds here. Maybe we should bring it back to economics. Sorry.
Yeah. No. I think
thanks for indulging me.
It's what streams are all about. So yeah, no, I mean, so you know, good practice in model selection, right? Is that kind of what you're talking about? And does the mechanisms underpinning the model sensible? Is that what you're getting at? That's like a better way of determining whether the model's any good.
Yeah, that we should judge a model based on the characteristics of the model, not about its ability to predict, because we can't evaluate it unless it's about something that is right. Unless it is a model that's predicting something that we can repeat lots of times, then we can. But if it's a model designed to predict things that either will or will not happen, and it will or will not happen one time, or there will be one particular outcome, one particular percentage of people will use the metro in the first month, we can't judge the value of the model based on that one prediction.
Yeah.
Because we can't observe the probability models are designed to estimate probability distributions, and we don't observe one off.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I really like that McFadden example, and I think you might be taking it away from me. But yeah, I'll have to think about that, because I'll tell you what, I need to look at the confidence intervals on that prediction, because it's a really good point. It's a really good point.
And look at the model, right? Because otherwise we're just being Friedmanian about it, and we're like, I don't care what assumptions the model made; it predicted the number of people using the metro.
Yeah.
So let's look at the model. Be like, oh, actually, this model, all the assumptions are borne out by evidence. This looks like a model, and it seemed to predict, and that is what actually happened. So, but it could just be that there was a probability distribution over the number of people that would use the metro in the first month, and there was a 1% chance that it was going to be 13.6, and that happened to be the thing that came up in reality, and McFadden happened to be right, but not, it isn't good at predicting the rest of the distribution. I don't know.
Yeah, and qualitative analysis can help us with that, right? That's what you were saying earlier, with understanding whether models are any good. Qualitative, historical, using the term very broadly, can help us with that.
Yeah. I want to ask you about something else.
Okay.
Your thread.
Yeah.
Your thread. So you start the thread saying you have nagging doubts.
Yes.
About slide work, and when I read that, I read through the thread and then thought about it. I was like, that seems really good. that seems right. Like, our default position should be nagging doubt, right? We should approach every paper as a skeptic, and basically tell the paper, I have a lot of doubts about you, man. Convince me. That's your job. Convince me. So you said later on in your post, you said, I wrote it down. You wrote that you were like, look, I don't want to be overly dismissive quantitative work. I don't want people being like, oh, that's a quantitative paper, but look at this big list of things that are wrong with quantitative work. Like, don't do that. And I agree. I don't think people should do that. But I did think there's a really similar thing that they should do, which is look at this big long list of things that could be wrong with an empirical paper, with an applied economics paper. I'm going to take that list to this particular paper, and I'm going to see if this paper can deal with all of those problems that it might have. And if it does, then this paper is actually pretty convincing. And if it doesn't, I have my list of things I need to check. So I was wondering, like you said, nagging doubts almost like it was negative, but what do you think about that? Just that should be what we should be encouraging people to do. Have nagging doubts. Approach everything skeptically.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was hoping to do with the thread. I mean, I don't know what people think. But my experience is that that's not necessarily the case, whether in economics or in other quantitative disciplines. And maybe there's an equivalent to say about qualitative research. I don't know enough about it, but I don't know if people do it enough. But if people took that list and whatever else that they know or can find, and they kind of thought, well, here's a bunch of hurdles, right, almost for the paper to cross for any given study to prove that they've somehow overcome. Then that would be a great way to use it, which is exactly it's a really good way of putting it. It's kind of what I had in mind, and also why I didn't want people to be like, oh well, no, there's no way any research can ever deal with all of these, so therefore now I don't believe anything with statistics in it. Yeah,
this would be a good exercise for unlearning economics. Put together a list, a checklist, and say, look, if you're going to read an empirical paper, does that paper do these things? Can it answer positively to these, however you want to frame it? But if it does these things, you should probably read. You probably maybe believe it. Maybe it's okay.
That is a good idea.
And if it doesn't do those things, this is a bad paper. Don't read that paper if it fails it. I don't know. Maybe we could write that. We could write that together, maybe like a list of accessible things. If you're going to try to read an applied economics paper, and I don't know how many people that follow you and your audience actually would read an academic economics paper, but if they did, to try to create a sort of an accessible checklist, does this paper do these things? And I guess some things are probably too technical, but
I think quite a few people do engage with these things at some level or another, even if they're outside academia. No, that's a really good idea. Maybe we should write it. Unlearning and Peter's checklist for empirical
For
research.
applied work, for
Applied
papers
work.
that might not be garbage.
Yeah. Is this paper garbage? A checklist.
Is it bunk? We can just use the title of the chat today. Is this paper bunk?
Is this paper bunk? Yeah, no, that's a great idea. So I've got a couple more questions for you that actually hopefully will wrap things up, and they kind of also relate to what we were just talking about.
Okay.
So I think actually I really only have one question, because I was going to ask you how you communicate this to students, but actually I think you've answered that throughout, right? You've kind of talked about how you would lead with, the real world, how we understand if one thing has caused another, and without all the statistical jargon, and then move on to the statistics. Here's the technical stuff. Here's how we actually use this tool, but it's motivated by the real world, and we understand the real world, and we use DAG diagrams and things like that, right? Directed acyclical graphs for people in the audience, which are like a modern way of looking at causality and how one thing causes another, which are kind of relatively intuitive. So there's that. But I also think, what does this mean for people who are outside of quantitative research, which will be a lot of my audience, right? People aren't necessarily academics. They aren't trained. They can't use data. What do they do when they see an empirical economics paper or any quantitative social science paper? What would be the best thing for them to kind of keep in mind without asking too much of them technically? It's an easy question to finish with.
I guess that's a list that we need to write of questions that you should be able to answer. I think always be super skeptical. All right, the job of a researcher is to convince your reader of something, and I think whenever I read a paper, whether it's a sociology paper, I have something here on my desk from the Sex Research and Social Policy Journal, which is not an economics journal, clearly. I read it like a referee. So I read it looking for problems. And I'm not doing that to be a dick. I'm doing that because if I'm looking for the problems, I'm more likely to see the problems and then not be convinced. But if you're looking for the problems and you can't find the problems, you can't find the failures, it means the paper is probably pretty convincing. The paper is probably able to say what it claims to be saying, if that's what it's claims to say. So I think the big lesson is be skeptical, and be skeptical whether it's written by a Nobel laureate or whether it's written by me and everybody in between. Like be a skeptic, read it looking for problems, and then keep track of those problems and keep track of what you think. And this again might start to be too technical, but keep track of the problems you think are in the methodology or in the data, and what you think those problems will do to the results. So do you think this will introduce a positive bias, a negative bias? Are the standard errors going to be too small? Be very conscious about, don't just say, well, that's bad. Okay, well, why is it bad? And what would it do to the results? Could the badness or the problem that you found explain the result that you see in the paper? Because sometimes it goes the other way, right? Sometimes the result is supported, but there could be this bias, but the bias is working against you.
Sometimes you could actually be understating your case because of these issues, right? It could go either way. Yeah. So you can't assume that a bad paper is wrong, right?
Yes, yeah. And in fact, I have papers where there was a bias and we just could not figure out how to. We could show it in theory that this should be in our estimator. We couldn't do anything about it, but we were also able to show that, look, this bias is actually working against us. The fact that we find something is in spite of this bias, not because of it. So the true effect is probably larger than this because this bias is in our estimator. First thing, be a skeptic. And if you are a student, if you're studying economics, do your econometrics and take it really seriously. I think that's like a lot of economics. I don't know. Do you remember doing Edgeworth boxes and things?
Yeah. Yes.
Like, we teach so much bullshit and stuff that nobody's ever going to use. And it's a constant fight about, like, why are we teaching people this? Nobody cares about this. This is why do we teach the welfare theorems? They're so stupid, but they're like bedrock of economics education. And you just cannot get people to stop teaching them. so, some of your micro, a lot of your macro is kind of nonsense and not a great use of your time, I think. Some of it's going to be great and is really useful. But I think the econometrics, the causal inference stuff, I think that is extremely, extremely useful because it'll also teach you the tools you need to be a better skeptic. So even if you don't go out in the world and do econometrics and work as an economist, it'll help you identify bullshit, right? So reading the books by like Nick Huntington Klein or Scott Cunningham's books or Udaya Pearl's books, which can get a bit woo-woo in the causal inference world, but can be pretty out there. They help you identify bullshit in the world. So those things are really good. So like, be a skeptic and educate yourself so you can be a better skeptic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Somebody in chat says, wasn't Darrell Huff, who wrote How to Lie with Statistics, a shill for the tobacco industry? And yeah, the answer is yes. Is that when I found that out, I was so disappointed. It's like, I mean, it doesn't make the book invalid, but apparently for him it was more like a diary than a a warning, because he'd obviously put all of that into practice. I agree. I agree with what you said. I mean, I think you're not as extremely online as I am, but one thing I would say to my fellow very online people is, when somebody says the study shows this, the research shows this, and people do this online all the time, just, it's not nothing. It's not like they don't have anything, but don't defer to them. Don't be like, oh yeah, that must be right, because half the time they haven't even read the paper, let alone read it with Peter's critical lens. So just people read abstracts and they're like, yep, that sounds like it kind of supports my political views, and then they kind of hurl it at people like they've engaged with the research. So that shouldn't be given too much credence. Here's this paper that supports my argument. They often haven't engaged with it on any type of real level. Secret Asian Dan says, A, the study shows this. B, tell me more. Exactly, right? Yeah, exactly. Anyone who references a study, tell me more. Tell me more about this study. Explain it to me. Teach me, right? And if they can't, it's probably because they've just read the abstract and not gone much further.
Yeah, right? or just read a tweet about it, or just read a newspaper article that was badly summarizing the actual scientific study. I mean, this is what you said in your tweet that you something about reflexively reacting to applied papers. And I can't remember exactly what you said, but the word reflexively was in there. And it was like, I reflexively react to anything that's about health. Basically like, well, that's not true. Well, that's it's not that it's not true. Well, we don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know that. There's so much stuff in the newspaper. This is related to that. This causes cancer. All of those are correlation observational studies. They tell us nothing. They tell us nothing. So my reflex for those things is like, I'm not going to listen to those things. There was one other thing I was going to say about approaching things. I think be more agnostic. I think this is hard for all of us to do, but be comfortable not knowing stuff. Right? We like to watch the YouTube videos, or we like to read the book, or whatever it is that tells us we feel like we know this, or I watch a YouTube video that tells us about the war in Ukraine, or this about this other thing, and now I know it. Like, be comfortable not knowing stuff. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the world, but we didn't know anything. And we couldn't Google it, and we just had to be comfortable, like, not knowing stuff, and that was kind of okay.
Yeah.
And so I think a greater ability or desire to just say, I don't know. And not to say I don't know in a bad faith way. When people are like, it seems like Russia is attacking Ukraine, and you're like, I don't know about that. Well, it seems like that's probably true, and that's probably what happens. Like, good faith I don't knows, I think, are wildly underrated and underused.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And it goes, this idea, I was actually going to mention this earlier, this idea of strong beliefs weakly held, right? And it relates to progress in research that we were talking about earlier. I believe what I believe because I think that, it coheres with evidence as well as my values and logic and reason and everything. But I could have my mind changed, right? I could have my mind changed on this. And that could be by new progress within, research and how we do things. It could just be because of something I didn't know before. So I think, it's like humility on the part of people who produce research, right? And also people who read it and use it.
Yeah. I just see in the chat, somebody said, the worst is when you hear the phrase study proves X on the news. Could not agree more.
Yeah.
If you ever hear X proves X about anything to do with related to social science, that is not a true summary of that paper. And that is,
yeah.
As I said earlier, we do not prove things in social science. We just cannot prove stuff. That's not how we work. That's not the kind of science that we do.
Yeah. Nutrition's pretty bad for it as well. You get the, bananas cause cancer and, or something like that. And then you look at the study and it's like, well, actually, according to this study, which is just one study, but even supposing it's true, you'd actually have to eat, 100 bananas a day. And it's like, I think you'd have a lot of problems if you ate 100 bananas a day. Maybe one of them would be cancer, but right, like nobody's doing that, right? So you get these like people who don't understand statistics, or maybe who don't want to understand them. They just want a silly headline saying that there's some causal effect out there that isn't actually there.
Yeah, I mean that's something we didn't talk about today was effect size. So when we were talking about uncertainty. We talked about uncertainty, but we didn't talk about effect size, which is also something that's wildly underappreciated, underreported on. They just say, oh, this is related to that. And then you look at the effect size, you're like, but that's, you have to eat 100 bananas. So they're like, this is
absolutely. Well, it goes back to, it goes back to statistical significance, right, as well, which is like prizing something that has a p-value of 0.04, which, is not attributable to chance by the normal practice, but is actually such a small effect, right, that it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter.
And this is another bugbear of mine in applied economics work. We report things to 3 decimal places. Fucking heck, it makes you crazy. Absolutely winds me up.
Yeah, absolutely. So insane
tiny little things.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so I've got. Do you have time maybe for a couple of questions from chat, Peter? And
sure.
Okay, cool. So insane idiot. People's names on this always make me laugh. I'm curious about what I see as somewhat of a contradiction on one end. Social sciences try to avoid creating laws or fundamental truths like natural scientists, and that view has been echoed here. But what do you think about things like the law of supply and demand in describing prices? Is this something you think economists should avoid, or is this an exception?
It's a great question, insane idiot. So I think it's not that we try to avoid making laws and universal truths. It's that we can't discover them, right? We're not able. They don't exist in our field of study. So, and I think part of the problem is language. So we talk about the law of supply and demand. There's no law of supply and demand, right? There is some observed regularities that it seems like when prices go up, fewer people buy that thing. Most of the time, in most circumstances, but not always. Right? You have given goods. Most of the time when prices see more people wanting to produce that good, all else being equal, because now you can make more money. But not always, right? Prices could be going up for lots of different reasons. So I think part of the problem is just the language, right? We should call it like the idea, or someone in your chat has said the pattern of supply and demand. Yes, there's a pattern of supply and demand that can help us understand the world. And maybe most circumstances, we can use that very simple model to understand price determination. But clearly not in all circumstances, right? Prices sometimes go up and demand for that product goes up. That can happen. So
financial assets being one example.
So I think it's language. I think we shouldn't call it the law. I get a pattern, the idea, the supply and demand, all those things are better language. But, economists back in the day were much keener on we are discovering universal truths that we just aren't. We just aren't.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't like the use of the word law in economics at all. You have these kind of regularities which apply in a particular time and place, right? And that's what we're trying to uncover with empirical work, but making broad generalizations across time and space, I think, is a bit of a mug's game.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if there is a law, it's that people respond to incentives, but that is so broad and abstract as to be meaningless. Right? I think so much of who we are and what we do is cultural. And so the idea that there's some universal law about how human beings behave is just, it's not that we avoid making them, they don't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. So Alexander Russell says, this is a very specific technical question. Are quantitatively models, I think he just means are quantitative models, with fewer free parameters necessarily better than higher parameter models that explain the same set of observations?
It depends. I guess, what do you mean by explain? So you explain like the ability to predict within sample, I guess, as we were talking about earlier.
Probably, I'm guessing he's talking about some kind of statistical fit.
Right. So this
should
might
we
be
have
more
fewer
like,
parameters than rather than more?
So I guess it depends. What is your objective? So if your objective is prediction, and you're using some sort of machine learning thing to predict, what Instagram advert, all those algorithms are just predicting what you're going to click on, right? So are more parsimonious models better? I think so, because you don't want to overfit. Overfitting is always a problem. But to be honest, I'm not an expert on like ML. I'm not an expert on predictive algorithms, anything like that. But I think overfitting in any exercise can be a problem. So in that sense, fewer can be. So I think fewer is better than too many, and where you end up overfitting your model. But I don't think there's a rule which says 8 parameters is the right number. Eight variables is the right number of variables. I don't think that exists. It's totally context dependent. But there are estimators like lasso estimators and stuff that are designed to pick a parsimonious set of variables that predict your outcome.
Yeah. So it's all about reducing the number of parameters as much as you can before the model doesn't fit the data enough, right? There's just just.
But I've never used those methods. I can't speak to them. I don't know enough about them.
Yeah. So there was one question up here. This is a question about Bayesian statistics. We've managed to avoid talking about that. So yeah, do you think Bayes is it used in economics? Does it add much value?
Does it add much value? So there are certainly Bayesian econometricians. I was raised like most economists as a frequentist, and I much like being raised Catholic in real life. I really regret it and resent it. I think Bayes stuff is just a lot more intuitive. I guess in terms of like teaching people how to think statistically, Bayes is just a lot more intuitive for getting people into the world of statistics. I think in general, like the outcomes and the estimates tend to like asymptotically approach each other, right? I think you can do like, there's a Bayes version that'll give you VOL. So I resent being raised as a frequentist because I think it's a very unintuitive approach to statistical thinking and uncertainty. And I think Bayes is better. Yeah. Saying that in economics, we definitely view Bayesians as odd. Right? Yeah. They're definitely like, oh, she's a Bayesian. Oh, watch out. But I've tried to go back and read some like introductory textbooks which were Bayesian in nature, and I just like, God, why we should all be learning it this way.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the value added ultimately is, because I think you end up in the same place most of the time.
I mean, I saw this in response to my thread on, just to recap for people, about some of the potential shortcomings of quantitative research, and I think the thread was kind of implicitly frequentist. I didn't really talk about Bayesian estimation, and at least one person said, well, Bayesian estimation is better, and I think because it's more intuitive and transparent. So in Bayesian estimation, what you do, there are two things that I think are more intuitive. One is that you state your prior belief. I thought that this was going to go this way, and then you kind of update your view based on what actually happened, based on the information. Now that's, Bayesians would argue, very transparent, right? Everyone has biases. We've been discussing it here, right? People have biases in research. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they might not be political, but biases go into research. In Bayesian econometrics, you're very clear, this is the bias I'm going into it with. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Bayesian estimates, you can interpret them much more intuitively, right? Can't you? You can interpret them as like, here's the probability that it's X, as opposed to the frequentist interpretation with statistical significance, where it's like, under the null hypothesis that there wasn't an effect, then the probability that we would have observed the outcome that we did, it's like, okay, nobody understands that until they've been studying statistics for like 2 years, right? And maybe not even then. It's a really strange world, frequentist statistics, right? So Bayesian econometrics is more intuitive and more transparent. Those are benefits that are, you know, good for communication and understanding. They don't seem to be substantive benefits. So I think I agree with you in that I'm not sure. I've never been persuaded that Bayesian econometrics is kind of inherently better, only that it's a more intuitive and transparent way of presenting statistics.
Yeah, like it's an easier road to the same place. I've never seen anybody be like, oh, the effect, the sign on the effect will be reversed if you use the Bayesian method here. I think we end up in the same place. But yeah, I wish I was raised as Bayesian. Yeah, I find it much more intuitive. It's a lot easier to understand.
Yeah, yeah. I think, well, it does seem to be taking over gradually. I don't know. Maybe in 20 years it will be the default.
I think the Bayesians have been saying that for 150 years.
That's
so I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah, that's true.
It's also a really interesting argument. I think it's a good argument against the idea that academia or research or human learning is a marketplace of ideas, because I feel like Bayes is just a better idea about how to think about and teach statistics, and yet we just do not do it.
Yeah.
Right. It just doesn't. In the marketplace, that is the better product. That is the MacBook, and people are still using, I don't know, whatever not a MacBook is. Whatever an IBM, does IBM still exist? I don't know. That's a bad analogy, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So, okay. So I think, yeah, that's everything that I've seen in chat. So, is there anything that we missed? Anything points you wanted to make? Any questions you had for me?
I'm just looking at my list of questions. Oh, I have one more question, and then let's call it quits. All right. So when it comes to applied work, there are existing, not solutions, but there are existing approaches that I think dominate current common practice, and yet don't seem to be adopted. And these seem to be pretty simple things. So the three examples I had were, one, just getting rid of critical values, like not having critical values, not putting stars on estimators. And some journals now don't want you putting stars on your estimator to show how significant it is, but they still have the papers might still talk about significance. Another would be inverse hyperbolic sign transformation, which is a bunch of fancy language for basically, if you have an outcome, what do you do with it? If you take the log, the zeros go away. A lot of people have taken log plus 1. That's not any good either. Mm-hmm. So there's this other transformation that you can interpret in the same way, but deals with the zeros. The other one is a Schwartz criterion. So we know as sample size goes up, the chance that you're going to get a statistically significant result goes up. So the Schwartz criterion is a way of having a critical value, but the critical value is adjusted with sample size. Mm-hmm. So basically your critical value gets larger, your critical T statistic gets larger, the larger your sample. They used to do this back in the day, and then it just went away, and everybody uses 0.5. So this is just a handful of small things. How can we do a better job of getting economists, applied people, to use the really straightforward and simple to implement improvements that do exist? How do we get them to use these things?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, it's really difficult. So are you talking kind of on an individual level? How do we convince people? Or are you talking more at like the institutional level? You know, what do we do?
No, like at an individual level. So like I've had it, every PhD student I've had, right? They like running regression. That's the first thing. So we have to have like no regression are allowed for a few months. But they also like to take the log of the outcome variable, because that's what we're all taught. So they end up taking logs of zeros if there's a math point is 0 in their outcome. And I'm like, just use inverse hyperbolic sign. Same interpretation, it's better. Use it. Yeah. And they just won't. They always come back with a log. Like, you have to use it. Use this. I've refereed papers. They're like, just use it. This isn't fancy. This is not fancy. This is a single line of code. It's very easy to do. But it's like pulling teeth. Like it can't get people to do it. You get something with big data set. Okay, use your Schwartz criterion. If you want to use your critical value, just adjust it. You have 3 million observations. Of course, you're going to find something at not 0.5%. So at the individual level, how do we better encourage or convince people to use the simple solutions that do exist, that are out there?
I guess it's. I'm not sure if this is a satisfying answer. Is it just a case of just keeping asking people, just keep doing it, even if we're basically not really getting much in the way of a response, and trying to persuade other people who agree with us to keep doing it until it kind of creates a sort of critical mass or something? I mean, I don't know. That's kind of normal for cultural shifts, right? Isn't it? You have to just keep shouting in the dark for a very long time, and having nobody listen to you until eventually it happens. That's not a very satisfying answer. I'm sorry. I don't know. I'm not that persuasive, so I'm not sure. Okay. I know about the right rhetoric. I mean, I will say certainly not screaming at them in seminars.
Do a tweet thread about inverse hyperbolic signs.
Yeah. That's the next tweet thread. A 30 tweet thread about inverse hyperbolic signs.
I mean, tell the world. The people need it. Yeah, the people need it. Or using Poisson when you have I don't know. There's lots of very simple tools that we don't teach, and so people don't use them. And running a probit with robust standard errors. What are you doing? Don't do that. That's definitely getting too technical. Sorry, everybody. But things that make me crazy, that are there's a very simple solution. You're not using it. I don't understand why.
Yeah. I think it's part of our role as teachers as well, right? To be, to teach it to students too, right? Because that's the one place where we do have some authority and influence. Hopefully, if anywhere, we can kind of, before they start engaging in these bad habits, we can try and nip it in the bud, right?
Yeah, I guess this is why I need to go to the head of teaching and demand that I teach all of undergraduate economics so people stop doing silly things. Not that I have all the answers by any means, but I'd like a shot anyway.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it.
Somebody in your chat says they're in my class.
Oh yeah, Nessie Andrew. Hello.
Hey Nessie, how's it going? Hopefully see you at our next drop-in. Come by and say hi.
So I've kind of put a cut on the questions now because it can just go on forever, and there's a bit of a lag between the chat and the stream and everything, except there's one that's come up a couple of times, which is, what are your recommendations, Peter, for somebody just getting into economics, your book recommendations and maybe your article and paper recommendations? For someone just getting into economics, so you're a first year undergraduate or something, or just anybody out there that's interested in anybody. Economics? I think it's somebody who's out there who's not necessarily trained in economics. How can they get started?
Okay. That's a really good question. I guess it depends how far down the rabbit hole. I'm just looking at my books to see just how far the rabbit hole you want to go. I mean, it's an oldie but a goodie, I think. But free economics had a massive influence. Kind of the reason I ended up wanting to do economics. It's a terrible title of a book, but it's a great summary of Levitt's work. And I think Levitt's work over the years has been varied in quality, but he was also very committed to causal identification to a lesser degree than Card, etc. But was very interested in it. And so free economics is just basically the chapters that just sort of summarize some of his earlier research papers. Similarly, there's a book called The Y-Axis, which is a summary of John List and Yuri Nizi's work, which is much more doing experiments out in the world. So they do a lot of shoe leather stuff. They're really running experiments out in neighborhoods. The Y-Axis, W-H-Y.
Oh, the Y-Axis. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the Y-Axis is excellent. If you are interested in the causal inference stuff, I think Scott Cunningham's book, which is free, is fantastic, called Causal Inference, the Mixtape. It can be a bit technical. If you're interested in more of the philosophy of causality, which I think is really important, because causality is an economic concept, it's not a statistical concept. Someone challenging that view is a guy named Udaya Pearl, who's at UCLA, who's also on Twitter. He's very acerbic on Twitter. raking economists over the coals for our views about causality. But he has a book called, what is his book called? Did I lend it out? He has a couple books. Let me just have a quick Google.
Is it called The Book of Why?
The Book of Why, that's what it is. So the Book of Why is as entry level as it gets with Udea, but really, really interesting and kind of blows your mind because we talk about causality, and as you're reading that book, you're like, oh, we barely understand what that word means. And so he really tries to build a more formal vocabulary around it, but also statistical, mathematical notation around causality. He invented do calculus, where his argument is, look, causality is a statistical phenomenon. It's just we never had the right way to talk about it, and now he's invented it. So he's a computer scientist. He's like legendary in the field of artificial intelligence. He made massive leaps in artificial intelligence, and he abandoned a lot of it because he came to this realization that actually real artificial intelligence is going to be about understanding causal relationships. Like that is what is particular about human intelligence, our ability to infer causality and understand that X causes Y to some degree. So really, really interesting dude. Recommend his book, The Book of Why, The Y Axis. Somebody asked about if you're in high school. If you're in high school and you want to, I think there's a book called Naked Economics by a guy named Steve Whalen, I think. He has a book called Naked Money, which is naked statistics, which is great, like super non-technical, no math in it whatsoever about statistics. Really love that book. And he does Naked Economics, is a bit more the sort of micro stuff. I think it's really good. I'm probably, maybe this is too many books, but if you're interested in sort of micro econ, like pretty standard, like textbook micro econ, there's a book called The Inner Lives of Markets, which gives you a little bit of the intellectual history of economics in the 20th century. The sort of each chapter is one of the big economists and their sort of revolutionary paper and why it was insightful. So like the chapter in there about Acker law. Yeah, that's probably enough. But if anybody wants to email me, I'm easy to find on the internet. If you want to email me, I'm happy to get more.
Yeah.
I just off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Those are the books I recommend.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I recommended Freakonomics certainly because I've got like a reading list that I put together for people trying to get into economics, and it's like, although I think some of it should be taken with a pinch of salt. In terms of the findings, like some of them have kind of been overturned and stuff. I mean, it's kind of old now, right, for economics, but I think the way they explain the approach to causality is very intuitive and clear and understandable to a newcomer. And, you know, it's kind of fun. And, so I do agree with that one. And the other ones I've not read, but they sound really good. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. This was really fun.
Yeah,
it was really nice to chat with you.
Yeah,
my first time on Discord. What a.
The first time on Discord and also Twitch.
Oh, Twitch. Is this Twitch? Is this not Discord?
No. They're two different things. You're phoning me on Discord, but you're being broadcast on Twitch as well as YouTube simultaneously.
Okay.
Yeah.
What a world! What a world we live in. What a world. Yeah, thanks. Have a good evening. Have a good evening, everybody. This was fun.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Jon Robinson. Yeah. All right. Bye.
See you. Thanks, chat.